Well, good evening, everybody. Thank you so much for coming out tonight. It's lovely to see everyone here. And we are very delighted to have Helena Norberg-Hodge presenting tonight. She has been incredibly instrumental in this shire because she's the one who helped start all the farmers' markets. And, well, personally in my life, I am so grateful for that, and I'm sure many people here are. And not only that, but she has written, well, over 5 books, some of which are here tonight on sale at very reasonable prices if you'd like one. And they are called Ancient Futures, Local is Our Future, From the Ground Up, Bringing the Food Economy Home, amongst others. And she's also the producer of 2 films. One is called The Economics of Happiness, which many of us may have seen, and the other one is called Planet Local, a great name. And so Helen has really been working for decades now to make us aware that our dependence on global economies just has not going to go well in the long run, and that if we really want to let's just say live life to the full, we need to get back to decentralized, regional and local economies, supporting our local farmers, supporting our communities, doing things that bring us back to the earth, to encourage us to really be in touch with the earth and with its plants and trees, and just feeling that connection with the earth, which seems to be getting so lost with the kind of centralized, corporatized industries, particularly in farming, where they're wrecking the soil. So Helena's doing fabulous work, and I'm very grateful to you, Helena, and I'd like to bring you to the stage. So let's have a warm welcome for Helena Norberg-Hodge.
I'm very glad that Pratima has been able to revitalize what used to be politics in the pub. And this pub used to be absolutely full, and there were very interesting discussions going on every month. Sorry? I'm very grateful to Pratima for revitalizing politics in the pub. This pub used to be full of people about once a month for a couple of years with very interesting discussions, and I hope for 5 years. Wow! And I should also mention that Liz Elliott, who was involved in that, it was her idea to do politics in the pub, and she's unfortunately can't be here tonight. But this kind of thing is part of what we try to encourage as part of the whole localization movement. And right now, it's a bit hard to talk about how destructive the global economy has become, because it can sound extremely overwhelming and very frightening. But overall, our message is so much more empowering and so much more positive than the dominant stories that you now get in academia, in the media, virtually every avenue of knowledge. Because what's been happening is that without realizing it, we've all bought into a story about progress. And this was linked to a story about economic growth. That economic growth was based on using lots of fossil fuels to replace human beings with bigger and bigger techno systems and drive people away from smaller towns and cities into bigger and bigger urban conglomerates. What's happening now is that our political and economic leaders are still wedded to an idea about growth, which was also linked to the idea that more global trade is always a good thing. And what's happened in the last 30 years is that this addiction to global trade has led to a situation where global businesses are in effect subsidized, they don't pay tax, and very importantly, they are deregulated. They have no rules. In fact, what's happened is that global corporations, including banks, are giving the marching orders to our national governments. It means that we have a situation where democracy is a bit of a joke, because with the global media that are part of the corporate global system, every national election is essentially shaped by the money interest. Now, this is a very bleak picture, but why I say that our message is so hopeful is, number one, that the dominant narrative tells us that this is all happening because we want it. It's happening because we're greedy, and we're not listening to these warnings about climate change and the decimation of nature. It's blaming humanity, human beings, for this problem. What we are seeing is that all around the world, at the local level, people are demonstrating another path, that it's a human scale path. It's putting an end to the isms. Capitalism, communism, and socialism, those isms, and of course fascism is another one we want to throw out. It's putting an end to those isms in terms of saying localism or localization puts an end to top-down, hierarchical, monocultural structures that impose themselves on life. I'd like to also to tell you that we every day in our email inbox, we get so much inspiration from the people all around the world who are excited about this vision of localization and are actually doing it. It includes the biggest social movement in the world, which is Via Campesina, which is about 200 million farmers who have been trying to wake people up to the fact that the global economic system, supported by our government, is destroying farmers everywhere. The whole farming issue, the food issue, is central to all of this, and I hope we can have more of a discussion. But before that, I want to introduce Henry Coleman, who's been working with us since he was 15. Henry, do you want to come up? And another thing that inspires me is to be working with young people. Henry's now 26, but he started with us basically when he was 15, and maybe you could say something about that.
Okay. Yeah, hi, thanks Helena, thanks for having me here, interrupting the matriarch of localization, as she has been dubbed, to give my kind of novice perspective, but I came across The Economics of Happiness, which is Local Futures film, when I was 15 years old, and that's why Helena says from 15, but what it did for me, which I hope it can do for all of us, which I hope this localizing perspective can do for all of us, is it helped me realize that human well-being, prosperity, all the things we all want in life, do not have to be at odds with ecological and planetary well-being. We're told that only through globalization, development, and more industrialization can we bring about a situation where people have access to their basic needs, and their only global food systems can feed the world, only industrial agriculture can feed the world. It's a narrative that we're all told, and the truth of it is, which is what the Economics of Happiness made clear to me, is that the global system is impacting all of us in really disastrous ways. It's breaking down our community structures. It's making more and more people running faster and faster to stay in place, which is Helena's language. But the economic pressures on us all, as well as it's that system that's responsible for driving up resource and energy use, pushing us into big cities, etc., and thereby destroying the planet. So the other way, localization, rebuilding the fabric of smaller place-based economies, is a way to use resources in a more intelligent, wiser way, produce more food per unit of land because you're producing diversified for local rather than monoculture for global, and do so in a way where you're providing more jobs using less tech, using less mining, and not going down this whole disastrous path of mega wind farms and nuclear power, which the Green New Deal tells us is our future. But at a deep level, we all know that that's not the case. That's not going to save us. Anyway, we'll go into that probably a bit later. But that's kind of the perspective that I came to see through Local Futures work, and the more I do in that, the more I just it puts a lot together for me. So I'll leave it back to Helena on that note.
We also wanted to show a bit of the film that Henry and I basically directed together, and a young local filmmaker, Nara, and Tian, who's sitting there too, helped with that film. It's called Planet Local, A Quiet Revolution. And I also want to mention there are 2 US college students here who are helping us do research to try to strengthen the local food movement here. So it's just really wonderful to be working with, young and old alike around the world. And we'll play a bit of this film that might repeat some of the things we've said, but they need to be repeated, we believe.
Beyond the mainstream media, on the ground on every continent, a quiet revolution is emerging. People are seeking community, collaboration, ways of life that nurture the natural world instead of destroying it. Farmers' markets, small business alliances, transition towns, mutual aid networks, community banks, agroecology schools, alternative education, permaculture, eco-villages, and more. Collectively, these diverse initiatives demonstrate a new path forward for humanity. It's a path that localizes rather than globalizes, connects rather than separates, and shows us that human beings need not be the problem. We can be the solution.
We are facing an emerging global civilization and the danger of global monoculture. And it is this danger that can be countered by the localization movement. It is localization that can enable the emergence of diversity, identity, autonomy, and resilience.
This is a time for localization. It's modest, it's simple, almost beguilingly simple. But it's also complex. It also means that we have to shapeshift. It also means we have to be different.
Just a short little snippet from the film Planet Local, which is for free on YouTube. We made it just this year, and basically trying to raise awareness about, which is our whole campaign, World Localization Day, which it was made for. Our whole campaign is trying to raise awareness about the good stuff that's happening at the grassroots, because obviously that is stuff that doesn't get airtime on mainstream media. It doesn't really get that much airtime on social media. The algorithms don't like it. It's like it's stuff that completely goes under the radar, and then we're left with this picture that everything is being destroyed and no one's doing anything, and actually the truth is that's not the case. I hope people could see the definition that we had there of localization. Do you want to say more about what we actually mean by that?
Yeah, well, yeah, also I realized we had some more snippets, but it doesn't show enough. I think we want to do more film stuff. Isn't that true? You couldn't see that well back there, could you?
Not for Japanese.
No. But so I think we probably won't do more film stuff anyway. So yeah, I mean, defining localization is really connected to understanding globalization. And economic globalization was a trajectory whereby governments brought in trade treaties to make the activities of global traders in finance and goods, to free them up, to be able to enter and go out of any economy without any restrictions. This was brought in very consciously after the Second World War to avoid another world war, to avoid another depression. A lot of people who brought that in really believed that this is in the interest of humanity. Probably at that time already, there were giant banks, there were the Rockefellers, there were big boys that realized how great it was for them. But I know, there's so much evidence of the good intention that went into this. So they didn't just set up the World Bank and the IMF, they set up something called the GATT, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. Later on, people became critical of the World Bank. They could see that the World Bank was actually favoring the rich over the poor, but there was very little discussion of the trade treaties. I helped to start something called the International Forum on Globalization. I was able to get the support of some big funders, and 40 of us from around the world could meet regularly and discuss the impact of the trade treaties on Chile, on Japan, on Sweden, on America. And it was always a question of destroying local businesses, particularly farmers were the first victims, as I said earlier. So I started promoting localization as the systemic antidote. And that meant, in policy terms, that we needed to look at new trade treaties that were not going to allow global monopolies complete freedom, that were going to be involving democratic process to discuss how do we prevent monopolies from running the world that we don't even know the names of. I think you should look at the film Monopoly if you haven't. It's a YouTube film that looks at how much power Vanguard and BlackRock have. I mean, in effect, they now own the world. And yet we never get to hear about this discussion in our political sort of theater that's going on now, because we're not actually being enabled to discuss this one. So localization is something that we can all support from the bottom up right now, and that's what we want to talk more about tonight. But I also want to urge you to speak out as what I call a big picture activist, to let people know about these trade treaties, to let them know that even at the level of climate negotiations, it's big business setting the agenda. And they are setting an agenda which allows them to keep polluting more and more, and to trade in what they have defined as the crucial element, which is carbon, brought in by big business. They've reduced this complex issue to this tradable commodity. Net zero, carbon, most of what's being now spelled out is actually not helping us to move in the direction we need to. And maybe, Henry, you could tell people a little bit about, before we go into the good news from the grassroots, talk a bit more about the policy side, and maybe tell people about redundant trade and some of the statistics around that.
Okay, yeah, so I did some little statistics gathering. I won't be able to remember any of them, so don't get excited. But one of the things that is a bit of an in for people into looking at this system is realizing what it is, hearing about what we call insane trade or redundant trade, which is the fact that countries are routinely importing and exporting identical quantities of identical products. So last year, Germany was the world's second largest importer of milk and the world's second largest exporter of milk. The US imported $3.5 billion worth of beef and exported $3.75 billion worth. So there's this kind of crazy logic to this system that when people kind of realize that, they're like, oh, you know, we thought global capitalism was efficiency, and we thought, you know, how is this possibly happening? And part of it, something that we're really trying to raise a lot of awareness about are the subsidies, taxes, and regulations that are key to supporting a global system. So our governments are setting up communications infrastructures, expanding ports, expanding highways to the tune of, it's like $50 billion a year for ports, for example. That's one of the ones I remember from today, 50 billion. But, billions of dollars for telecommunications, for AI, for quantum computing, for all of these systems that make barcode technology at the supermarket cheap. So food that is, so every price tag in a supermarket, not just for the barcode technology reason, but for all of these reasons, is an artificial construct. And, you know, trying to realize that, oh, we can actually recreate an economy by using those mechanisms, even at the local level, not just having to do it all on the global level, but we can use local subsidies, taxes, and regulations to make local, organic, healthy food the most accessible and affordable food in the marketplace. And if we did that, how different our world would look. What was I going to say? Anything more?
Well, maybe about the big
Yeah. Okay. Just that real point. Another point that we really want to drive home is the connection between long-distance trade and monoculture and factory farms that are really chemical intensive, resource intensive, wasteful. If you're growing something for a global market, you're forced to produce a standardized mass production. Helena says carrots of the same size, all straight, perfect for the supermarket. Apples with no blemishes, and if they don't ripen all at the same time, you burn up to half, sometimes 80% of the crop in Australia. 80% of tomatoes burnt because they didn't fit the bill when they were harvested. They were harvested, whatever. So there's all of this madness of a system that can't appreciate life. It doesn't have eyes, it doesn't have ears, it can't actually appreciate the diversity of life, and so it ends up killing. It's a monocultural system, as Helena will say, that is anti-life. Whereas when you have the local market, you're creating that market pressure to produce a diversity of things, and it can be seasonal, and it can be more of this week and that week.
Maybe I should just also stress when he said could create the market pressure. A local farmer's market here doesn't want a ton of straight carrots, can't deal with that. So I'm so happy to know many of the farmers who, from the beginning when I helped to start the markets in Byron, took 4 years by the way, but they've started diversifying because it's in their interest to actually grow a range of things that people want. And whenever we encourage diversification of the land, we are encouraging more productivity. And so this is one of the absolutely fundamental truths that we really need to wake up to. It's about economic literacy linked to ecological literacy. So I often talk about eco-literacy being the two. That the economic system that's developed has been pushing monoculture, and that the decentralization or localization is essential because diversity is a absolutely foundational principle of life. So we must localize. Now, to what extent? To what extent do we shorten distances? To what extent do we find ways of keeping certain elements of global trade? This needs to be discussed now when we're talking about policy choices. But what we really are so happy to have been able to do is to encourage people at the local level to start building those conversations and relationships at the local level. Connecting farmers and consumers, we would argue, is the most important. But that's also because when you study the global food system, you will see that it's the biggest contributor to climate change, to mountains of plastic, to pesticides that are linked to cancer, to Alzheimer's. I mean, we don't get to hear all of this, but the chemicals and the disastrous impact of chemical industrial agriculture at a global level is the biggest reason for us to localize. When we localize and we start linking farmers and consumers, what's also so wonderful is that we are seeing not only farmers happier and people who shop at the farmers markets happier. By the way, there were studies that show that in the farmers market, people have 10 times more conversations with each other than they do in the supermarket. So we could give you many, many, many more examples. I suppose for me, my favorites also include working with projects where prisoners have been allowed to start doing the gardening and production of vegetables and how it's transformed hardened criminals. And I've seen it in several places, in both America and England. And these things are coming to Australia. Australia is behind countries like America and England in this regard. But the healing effect also on depression. Johan Hari, you may have heard of Johan Hari and his book about the epidemic of depression, and you will see case studies in there that talk about people linking together in community to work with the soil and the seeds and the land and the productivity that comes from engaging in that way. And again, there are so many more things to say about that because it's also it's so inspiring to realize that when you help people engage in the food cycle, you're helping people to engage with nature in a way that you don't if you just plant trees, for instance. That's usually like a one-off thing. But when you're engaged in the whole food production thing, it's an ongoing process, and you have this remarkable and wonderful central, basically the central essence of culture. People celebrate over food. They love their food. It's deeply part of their culture. And we evolve in connection with that. Again, there'll be a million good stories to tell you. And a new one right now is the head of a prison in Bristol. Chaplain, he's the head chaplain. So he's the head of it. They have chaplains for every religion. So there are 12 religions in this prison, government prison in Bristol in the UK. And this is a Muslim who now is trying to bring nature into Islam. And that includes that in the prison, they now have greenhouses and chicken. They don't have a lot of land, so it's on a small scale. But he's already not just bringing nature in as an idea, but as a practical, ongoing practice.
Yeah, no, that's interesting. I didn't even know that example, so that's good. Yeah, you tell me that. Only to say that I think really people are waking up to the desire within us all to be engaged in meaningful, productive work with our hands, not just in food production, in crafts, in making clothes, in whittling wood. There's so many people, young people who don't actually want to be on the screen. We get this tarnish as a generation that we're all screen addicts, and of course that's true because they've been made addictive. There's addictive technology that's been imposed from above, but we also have that element to us that is waking up and realizing the damaging impacts of the social media, the damaging impacts of the screen, and the need to reconnect not only with our skills and with the earth, but with each other, with with different generations. And I really do see that wake up happening not only here, but I've worked in Ladakh with Local Futures, which is where Helena's work started, and there's a young farmers movement there too, as people wake up to the value of their traditional skills and their traditional culture, and the lies that we've kind of been sold through the education system, through media, about the values of a kind of corporate commercial culture that so many of us are sick of. So, I do have a lot of hope from that angle. I guess we should talk a little bit about, do we actually see hope for the future? And, we've been having conversations about that between us, because it can seem so overwhelming to change that global system, and yet we know there's so much that can go on locally to start changing that from the bottom up. To what extent that can change? Do you want to talk to that?
Yeah. Well, again, in the film, I hope you look at Planet Local and the economics of happiness, and you see examples from around the world what people are doing. I'm realizing more and more, though, that in order to really strengthen this movement, people need to be unlearning a lot of assumptions that they keep carrying. Because we basically, for generations, we've been brainwashed into buying into a path that took us away from community and away from nature. For us to really get back to community and nature, which I believe most of you want to do, this Byron Shire is full of people who talk about that and who want that. But we are all aware that it's not actually happening as much as we would like. We are aware that there's in fact a little bit of the opposite trend, that we're going to have to really work at building that. And I suppose, I feel that people are just not as aware and convinced as I am that when we regain genuine interdependence, community interdependence, and our deeper connections to nature, that we will be so much happier and so much healthier. Now, I know that because I lived in a culture that had not been colonized, that hadn't been developed, so that it was a universe, it was like a different world, where people were still so connected to the land, so connected to each other, that they were the lightest, most sparkling, joyous, and tolerant people I had ever encountered. And I learned to speak the language fluently. I lived with them basically over 40 years. I was there for every year. In the early years, I was there for whole years, and then half a year, and later on shorter periods. But I not only experienced this joy, but I also saw right in front of my eyes how the dominant Western consumer culture undermines the self-respect and the sense of connection that are essential for the deep joy that we all claim and we all want. The deepest, most universal human need is the need to be loved, and that is the need to be connected. And we're all now on this path where we were pushed away from the community connections that give children that sense of being loved, heard, listened to. As we've been pushed away from that, we've been pushed into a path that tells us that you have to prove yourself. If you're going to be loved, you're going to be important, you're going to be rich, you have to have a PhD, you have to have a flashy car. And parents, out of fear, before children are born, are wanting to put them in a good school so that they can get a good job, so that they can be those important people. And of course, we've been put on a path too where we need money for everything we do. So it's completely natural that we become greedy, that we want to store money because we don't know what the price will be tomorrow of just a loaf of bread in the marketplace. once you start rebuilding the local connections, you can start seeing a sense of relaxed faith in the community. People have been brainwashed into believing the opposite, but we are witnessing in the new local. So we're not talking now about old villages in Australia, villages that are still local, we have local shops, or even local villages in India, or even in Ladakh today. Ladakh today is not what it was 45 years ago. But what we're seeing in the new local is as people start reconnecting and start depending on each other, they suddenly start feeling much more secure. They suddenly start a situation where they're seen and known by name, they're real people, they're no longer, these weird, Muslims or weird something or other. No, this is Joe and this is Mary, these are people that you know. Prejudice is so linked to separation, to disconnection, to distance. Once we're closer, we see each other for who we really are. I don't know, this is a long story about the psychological benefits. But I think that what we didn't say before is that what's ended up happening is that this dominant system is imposing a monoculture in the human world. And it's hard for us to understand what it means, even in Sweden, where I come from originally, or in Ladakh, to be told, well, you're going to be inferior unless you speak perfect English. It's hard. So this is why the localization message also takes longer in the English-speaking world. Because we, of course, think it's great that everybody's speaking English. But imagine if you were told that you're going to have to be perfect in Ladakhi or Chinese if you want to succeed. I don't think you would like it that much. And I think you would like a message which talks about the need to restore biological diversity linked to restoring cultural diversity. Does that make sense?
Well, I was wondering if we should open up to questions and comments at this point.
Yeah.
Yeah?
I think, so, yes. Yeah, back there, pressing on.
I can probably speak up.
Yeah, okay.
I'm curious if you've heard about donut economics and any reflections on that and good, bad, the ugly in between.
Yeah. So do people know about donut economics? So donut economics is something that was started by a woman named Kate Raworth. And I think she was at Oxford. I know her, I've met her a few times. And it became very, very popular. And it's good. I think it's good but not good enough. It's definitely a positive addition because her main message is about the limits of nature and that we need to be conceiving of the economy as this donut where yes, we need to provide for human needs, but we also have to understand the limits of nature. So the main reason why a lot of people were happy was because there was a qualified economist who was reminding us about the limits of nature. I've spoken to her and I've tried to urge her to also look at this monopolistic control of our minds and of our governments. And she's not doing it. I think a lot of people are quite afraid to speak out about corporate rule. And I'm always, today I was on a program to do with the UN, organized by people in Japan, and I was the only one saying any of this. They were all talking about net zero and carbon, and I always make the point, which I absolutely believe, it's my experience, that it's not that the people in the corporations are nasty people. It's very unfortunate that there are many people who now believe that. What I'm seeing is that if you are working in Monsanto, and I've known some lovely people working in Monsanto who are passionate environmentalists, but they have become convinced that we must have genetic engineering to feed the world. And I've seen it again and again. There's this fear agenda that there are too many people now, how we're going to feed them. The latest propaganda is that we can't afford agriculture, that agriculture has destroyed the world, like what we're saying too. But we're saying industrial, for-profit, extractive, large-scale, monocultural. That's what's destroying the world. Smaller scale, diversified, employing more people can save the world. And the wonderful thing about that message is 8 billion people. We need a lot of people to restore the damage done by machines. And we've got to be really careful now of the propaganda that we want even more people removed from the land into giant cities and have robots do the farming. So much of what we need to look at is what we're thinking, and it's very good to have Kate Rayworth. We're organizing a big summit, hope, it will be big. We're getting so much interest, a summit in Bristol in the UK next September. It'll be about a 5-day summit with people from all over the world. I'm hoping to enlist Russell Brand and some other, Brian Eno and some other big names, so that we can give voice to the grassroots people who are coming from around the world, you know, to get more attention. Because it's such a positive view to know that these people are actually showing that we can produce more food per acre if we have more people on the land. But we're not getting to hear that in the media. So we need, hopefully, I invited Kate Rayworth for that too. I hope she'll join us. I don't know if she will. But the rethinking is so important. The unlearning from assumptions that keep us driving in the wrong direction is a very key part of it.
Can I just quickly pick up with some of my left brain stats? I'm not really that, stattier person. I don't know why. But anyway, so yeah, on the food thing, there are studies that show that we can produce 3 to 5 times more food per unit of land and per unit of water if we have diversity on that land rather than monoculture. So there are people doing that kind of research to try and prove that and to try and break that narrative. And of course that might change very dramatically depending on where you are and exactly, it's just a guideline. But another guideline that I heard from Matt Evans, who's an Australian chef, a week or 2 ago at the Caper Festival in Byron, was that he has some stats that show that if we were at the rate that nature, i.e. nature without humans, creates topsoil in arid areas of Australia. So there's a rate for that. I don't know how they calculate that. There's a rate for how much topsoil nature can produce. If we have humans producing food on that land, the rate at which we can create topsoil is 20 times more. So if it takes 100 years for nature to create that level of topsoil in this part of Australia, it takes only 5 years for humans to create that topsoil. And we can actually, get into a conversation about carbon and carbon sequestration and but that topsoil is absolutely, no one can deny the value of that. It is creating more nutritious, the ability to grow more nutritious food. It's holding water so that when we have floods that is held in rather than just running off the landscape. It is, it's bringing back biodiversity to that land, and that's so important. So we can be part of the solution, is the message. Our human intelligences, our hands and our eyes on the land can bring that land back to life, rather than having machines that are treating the land like a freaking factory and destroying the topsoil, as we have been doing. So we can be part of that solution. I think that's an important message, and not to think that, to also recognize that these kind of ultimatums we've been given, 7 years to do this before climate catastrophe or whatever, if we had a different economy that encouraged small-scale diversified production for local needs, we could be regenerating, careful with that word because it's corporate co-opted, on small scale and a large scale is what we're talking about, can bring life back to life and feed the global population. There's one message,
Yeah, and that means, in other words, 10 small farms with plenty of meaningful jobs on the farm. That's the other thing. When you work on a small, diversified farm, It's fun, and a lot of young people are actually finding that and wanting that. But it's very hard for them to actually make a living until they join the localization movement, and that means joining with consumers who understand the importance of that, and who for a while are willing to pay a bit more for really healthy, nutritious food, healthy employment in their community, and a healthy community. So partly what we need to do to create really vital and productive local economies is that we need to come together and we need to be willing to subsidize this in the sense we're going to need volunteerism, we're going to need people who are willing to be big picture activists, to speak about this, to explain that actually we can do things completely differently, and not only we can, but it's being done, can bring examples of where it's happening, and that we also need to urge people who can afford it, and now we have a lot of people who can afford it in this area because we're being invaded by a lot of very big money. We need to persuade them to help support, subsidize this. And by the way, this is another thing that's happened, is that the corporate brainwashing that's been going on, it has made this idea of charity a dirty word. Charity and philanthropy are not dirty words. We've been told that no, let's have trade, not aid. No, let's give people a loan instead of giving them a grant. This is how we've been brainwashed into pushing people into a commercial competition with monopolies. In order to get our local systems going, we should be willing to subsidize. In other words, we need charities that are willing to give a grant to help rebuild the systems of self-reliance. Once those systems get going, they're not going to need lots of grants. But to get these rusty wheels going again, we need to support it financially, we need to support it intellectually, and we need to support it, practically wherever we can.
Can I ask Helena, with the soil, surely, what do you feel as if the huge monoculture farmers in America, for example, they must be realizing that they're needing more and more fertilizer, that their soil is dying. There must be a tipping point. Do you think that's possible?
Yes, I do, but I have to tell you that even localization is being co-opted. So the Financial Times has now funded a woman named
Rana Faruha.
Rana Faruha. She's just made 3 documentaries talking about shifting from global to local, shifting from globalization to localization, funded by the Financial Times. And you look at the beginning of those videos and say, yeah, saying so much of what we're saying. But the solution is essentially corporate, large-scale, high-tech, remember the high-tech problem is that it needs so many minerals, it needs so much energy, it uses up so much of the earth, and we have so many extra people. We have this overabundant renewable energy of human beings who are just being dumped and replaced. So that means that in farming, they talk about the destruction of the land, the creation of erosion, how industrial agriculture isn't working, it's terrible, we need to go local, and then it's high-rise, hydroponic, AI run, and in manufacturing as well. So now, when we're talking about globalization, remember we're talking about the red carpet laid out for global banks and corporations to amass so much wealth that they have more power than government. Now they are coming home in many cases, like they're going back to America from China, but now using more minerals, more energy to replace even more people and to extract even more wealth to the top. So there's a lot of rethinking that needs to be done. I know I have my friend Brian sitting there, and probably Jason and Dinesh who are over there, who I know are probably worried about something that sounds so anti-technology. I don't know if any of you want to say something. If you want to say something, Brian? No, I shouldn't embarrass you. But I think that this is not about saying you don't want technology. It's about understanding the mega technological systems that are so resource and energy intensive and that are so dramatically able to replace people and to suit the needs of top-down monoculture. So when you think about AI, please think about just already when you try to bring a government agency or an airline now or an insurance company, which my friends have been struggling with after the floods, and you sit there for hours trying to get a human being. Finally, you get a human being. They are so robotized now as human beings, they can't deal with a unique situation. They are not able to put themselves into that unique context because it's too large, it's too distant. And this is why the closer the proximity, but of course everything doesn't need to be so close. When it comes to food, staple food, obviously it would be best for most people around the world to have it from relatively near. And things that come from the other side of the world will cost more. Right now it's inverse, so that everywhere in the world, food that's been transported for thousands of miles will cost less than food from a mile away. That's what's happening from Kenya to Ladakh to everywhere around the world because of this completely distorted economy. So we need to start thinking about this and reversing it. But also just want to say there's so much that we can do, maybe even without all this, which I keep going on about the big system. There is a lot we can do, but I also want to make a big plea for you being willing to look at that bigger picture and just study some of the basic principles. Because then you'll be so much more convinced about your need to localize. You'll be able to, even like there's the manager from Santos here, Jolene, and we're just so wanting Santos to be able to survive, to be able to still be a community-based business that does its best to support local producers, local, not just the farmers, but also those who are processing things. It's so difficult in this economy with all these hidden subsidies. So I do think a big picture education is vitally important.
Thank you very much, Helena, and your thank you for your dissertation this evening. It's been most appealing and informative for everybody here. One point I'd just like to ask is whether anybody has measured the huge environmental cost of moving all this food from one side of the world to the other and back again. And that is, we're talking about environmental issues here, and this must surely be taken into account when speaking of the kind of things that we're now discussing.
I hope, could people hear that question? This is another reason why it looks like a truly evil conspiracy when I tell you this. But the truth is that in the climate negotiations, this is not allowed to be discussed. There is no mention of the global trade, because global trade is holy. So not only do we not have the research we need, I mean, we've done our little bit with our limited funds, a small, little non-profit, but there is almost no research because people don't know this. Even in Greenpeace and in Friends of the Earth, I've spoken to the head of Greenpeace America, Australia, and UK about this mad, redundant trade. Remember, I don't know if you saw that there, but we're not only talking about importing and exporting the same product, but we're talking about fish sent to China to be processed. From Australia, from Norway, from the UK, and so much more. Sent to China to be processed, sent back again. We're talking about absolutely insane and unnecessary emissions. And then what do we get? Oh, human beings are so greedy, they won't listen, they don't care. We have to do, they don't learn from information. Well, we're not getting the information. So be careful of that story that tells you that you're to blame. Ordinary people are to blame. They want to hang on to their consumerism. No, most people now want to hang on to a roof over their head. They want to be able to pay for good, decent food on the table. They want to have a decent future for their children. They're actually not such nasty, greedy people. but we have a very nasty system that encourages consumerism. So it's a truly nasty system that even the people who are trained to market to 3-year-old children are generally not evil people. I really hope we can get away from this demonization of people and look at structures. Look at the structures. Don't either just talk about values. It's not about values. It's about blindness from the bottom to the top. Grace from America.
You can't tell by the accent. Yeah, I had a question. It might be a bit vague, but I was wondering how localization applies to communities that are built around one major industry. So there's lots of communities, based around mining and oil and things like that.
Well, I'll say something, and then we can see what Helena says, and then I can take notes. But I think when we're talking about localization, we're also talking about allowing people to keep their manufacturing jobs. So rebuilding regional and national industries is preferable to being run by deregulated global monopolies. So even just that process of shifting towards local, some communities might, some places would not go as local as others. So all of this would have to be determined through democratic decision making, and there might still be manufacturing communities and industries of a certain efficiency of scale that are national or regional. But you wouldn't have Toyota producing somewhere where labor is $10 an hour and selling it, or $1 an hour and selling it where it's 10, and then and you wouldn't have these. Also, you wouldn't have these industries telling governments how to build their own infrastructures and how to regulate their own economies to suit them. So you'd have some of these industries, but they'd be place-based in the sense that they'd be beholden to democratic oversight. And even that is a level of localization which would be freaking ideal. But do you want to say what you'd say to that?
Well, it's also a question, now of looking at what, essentially what we're talking about is diversity. So we're not talking about imposing on any part of the world, this standard local economy. We believe in democracy. We believe in people's rights to determine a lot of their own futures. However, where it gets tricky and where a lot of people on the left have been critical of localization is that we do now need, more than ever, international collaboration. International collaboration is vital. International information exchange is vital. Many people on the left have got confused and they think localization is about retreating down to your own local level. And like I was saying now, we do want people to have a lot of freedom to shape their future. But there are technologies out there now that will be an imposition on other peoples. So we do need to have international negotiations and agreements that will create an umbrella of environmental protection. And under that umbrella, there would be a huge amount of diversity. But you see what I'm saying, that when you have technologies like genetic engineering or nuclear power, that if a few people say, well, I want nuclear power, it can threaten, millions of other people's well-being. So that's again where technology becomes an important part of the discussion, and the cost of the technology in terms of the unseen mining somewhere else, destroying whole countries. So there's a complexity here to be discussed, but remember, what we're talking about is international information exchange, more face-to-face, real information exchange, because we're not getting it. We're not understanding the realities of what's going on right now in Uganda or Ladakh or Mexico. We don't get that information, which is again why wherever we can, we have international gatherings, we have sponsored what we call reality tours, both from community leaders, like in Ladakh and Bhutan to the west, and tours for Westerners to go to the other side of the world, have a better sense of what's going on there. Dinesh. A little louder, yeah.
To make positive change in this direction. Just to understand what the tangible things that we can do to make positive change in towards localisation in day-to-day lives.
Yeah, so Dinesh was asking what are some things that people can do to make a positive change in their life. But see, we generally tend to urge people to change the I to a we. So what we are finding is that we're really very interested in encouraging community solutions. So as an individual, yes, you can decide to shop at the farmer's market or shop at Santos, but in order to make the systemic changes we need, we're actually talking about coming together. So, you know, like I say, the farmers markets are a good example. The farmers markets need a lot of help to manage them better, to have more markets, to have more shops that are able to support this diversification and production. We need so much more help from the you know, basically the consumer in this region. I wish that I could persuade people who are concerned about climate change that one of the best things they could do is to help create a really thriving local food economy in this region. There was an article in the Echo today where I said that something like 15% of food in this region, consumed in this region, may be coming from the region. But the truth is that it's probably less than that. It's probably more like 7 to 10%. And even in areas like Vermont in America, where there's been a lot of activism for a much longer period, it still has a long way to go because the dominant system is pushing in the other direction. I believe that after the floods and after COVID, after people saw how the farmers markets were able to deliver when the supermarkets couldn't, I do believe we have the potential to build a stronger movement. But it means coming together as activists, as groups, and looking, because you know, we need to do quite a lot, and people can't just abandon their jobs, you know, mothers with their children. So we need to share the work of creating the, you know, getting the information, getting more volunteers. We'd love to start another farmers market, and we'd love to help with that. But there are also people who would love to see in this region a central market where we would have small producers basically 7 days a week or 6 days a week, and it would be a covered market. It's, as you know, many cities used to have that, and that's something that really should be a goal for us to do. In Portland, Oregon, they set up something a bit like that. But in order to make this really thriving and to make local food affordable for the majority of people, we really need to get active. And one of the things we haven't said enough about is that the regulations that the council imposed are regulations that work against us. We need affordable housing in this area. We could have affordable housing like that if we could get enough of a movement to insist on changing regulations to allow housing for local people, for the people who make this economy and this community work. And by allowing more homes on green spaces, obviously not everywhere, but it drives me mad to see around the world that local governments prevent that type of ecological and local housing potential, prevent it. When a giant developer comes in and wants to build 50 houses in an inappropriate area, the local council doesn't even have any power. And yet many people don't look at these regulations, they don't question them. Again, another reason why coming together with other people and discussing some of these issues might help to mobilize more people. Stephen. Can't hear you.
Okay, phone now. So what's the message for an individual living in Sydney or London or Shanghai. Because in an area like this, you can see how farmers markets can grow and local energy supplies, and we can get behind that. But I'm wondering if you're a family living in a big city, what your understanding of localization would be and how you could benefit from it.
Well, thank you for the question. I mean, definitely it's happening from the cities, in Sydney and Melbourne, in Beijing. I was so delighted to meet the farmer who started Little Donkey Farm in Beijing. And it's like this little jewel, and there's a donkey there too, and there's local food, and the family that started it are just, thriving, and everybody loves it. So it's happening from the cities and in the cities. But just be aware that the really healthy thing is when the city connects with the land around it. We don't want to support too much urban ag that is about high-rise ag. We don't really want that. That's being marketed as local, hydroponic, AI-driven, high-rise. What we want to support is the city's connection with the land around it. And yeah, there's a lot. I mean, because the corporations have us, our minds just they're co-opting every word, every bit of language, and it does make them sound beautiful. But as I say, I see a lot of good people who are doing it. And so another thing that's happening is that there is funding for urban ag, but there's almost no funding to discuss what Dee was talking about, this redundant insane trade, no funding to support real farmers on the land and the local food economy.
So to addressing what might happen in cities, I mean, I'm sure there are many things. We have a localization action guide which is available on our website, which some of those actions would be quite appropriate for cities. One of the things that I'd say is, a lot of areas that I'm familiar with of Sydney are being gentrified very quickly, and some of the most amazing shops that create a sense of community and that deliver people with good produce are having to close down, and these smaller businesses that are kind of almost, they feel like they're from a different era, and people appreciate that, and they gather around them, and yet they're under this wave of kind of gentrification and commercialization. If people can come together around those hubs that already exist and help them stay alive, say, even, I don't know what that would entail, making sure that their rent doesn't rise, and that would be a decision that could be made at a local government level. There are things like that even if it's not, even if it's not a new farmers market or a new something like this, there are levels of resistance or like actions of resistance that need to be taken in cities to make them, to keep the communities, at least intact a little bit, because they're kind of under the pressure of the other direction. Just one other quick thing, from me, if I can get my urban green left friends to start thinking about global to local rather than just capitalism versus socialism, I think that's a big step in the right direction. Even if we can just reframe, our understanding of politics in that way, I think I'd love to see that. I'd love to see that understanding about scale and speed and technology getting out there more.
And I do think it can happen. I do. But, a lot of people say it's so big now, and it feels like we're completely overwhelmed. But we need to remember that it's because we, as voters and citizens, have not been aware of what's going on. So we don't get to hear about this bigger picture. But I think once people start waking up to that, we could have a major shift, and it would so alleviate so much divisiveness that's going on right now, as people are so torn apart by politics of identity, whether it's to do with gender or veganism or rich or poor, or now even today on this UN program, this woman from Korea is discussing in Korea the difference between the young generation and the old generation. It's like, it's like all the time the system is finding lines of division, and to get us all focused on that and not look at the system that is squeezing us financially and psychologically, and particularly with this major issue of climate change, and that there is so little real discussion out there of what's going on and driving up emissions, and we have this simplistic language of carbon. So if you're interested, please look at our website, Maybe first at the films. We have a close colleague who is one of the experts on climate. She's been at every COP meeting. She just came back from Egypt now. I was just talking to her yesterday. She's Brazilian, but in Brazil they had the requirement that someone from an NGO would participate. So she's been representing the non-profit organizations, civic society, and has been at every one. So she has seen how it's big business sitting there constructing this language. And everything to do with net zero, everything to do with carbon is helping to confuse us and to usher in essentially a totalitarian, top-down monoculture like we have never seen, a very scary one. I don't want to, maybe I do want to scare people, but at the same time, I want you to know how many fabulous people are doing things in the opposite direction. And my friend Lua, who's here, is one of my heroines, is doing this. There's so many women in particular who are just going back to the earth, listening to their bodies, listening to nature, instead of listening to a left brain, very mechanistic worldview. And they're starting to actually awaken to something that inspires people, that creates health, that creates joy, that creates celebration. There's this huge cultural turning where people want a better relationship with nature. They want more community. Everybody, intrinsically we want that because we evolved that way. And there's so much happening from the bottom up. But it needs to be combined with an understanding of what's happening from the top down. And I think then we're going to see, real people power. There was something else I want to say before you said.
Good.
Sally.
I just thought it'd be interesting to hear a little bit more about net zero and carbon, and there's so much talk about climate change, and I think that feels like a really pressing issue, particularly at the moment.
Yeah. Well, can I give you one of my facts? Which is actually something I read in a book about, it's called Bright Green Lies, and it's reframing, telling us the truth about, we're told that that the global economy can transition to green energy sources, and it's just, reading this book made that so clear that it's like the biggest lie of our time, or one of the biggest lies. It's so, to transition half of our current needs, and remember these aren't needs, they're the needs of industries and of global businesses, they're not people's needs, but to provide half of what we currently demand, what is currently demanded through wind power would require the construction of 3.7 million new wind turbines, which is 2.5 billion tons of steel, 2.5 billion tons of concrete, and almost I think it's almost 2 million tons of copper, which is a rare earth mineral. And so it's actually just a new mega industrial project that we're being sold as the solution to our environmental challenges. And that is, to me, we so, as environmentalists, we've just so got to see through that and realize that we can dramatically reduce energy use and resource use by shortening distances, by localizing, by scaling down and slowing down, while providing for real human needs and recreating the structures of community. That is, for me, the vision that really urgently needs to be reintroduced to this climate today.
And also just remember that we are told, as Henry was saying, that we need this amount of energy. And we are not talking about what we need. Again, we're talking about what industry needs to transport things back and forth so that people, when they sit down to eat, are not able to eat food from their own country. They don't have the right to produce food themselves. That what happens is that for global business, self-reliance is the enemy. And self-reliance has been the enemy of the modern economy from day one. The principle of comparative advantage was saying, no, don't produce a range of things for your own needs, just specialize for export and then import what you need. So this goes back a long time. This was not invented yesterday. And we need to realize that in the last 30 years, it reached such unbelievable, ridiculous proportions and such obscene, extractive wealth creation for the few at the expense of the many. Just remember, there are fewer and fewer and fewer winners. There are more and more losers. We're talking about more than 99% of humanity is clearly losing in this. But it's just a question of us seeing this, that if we want to provide energy for people's needs, for our transport, for our housing, for heating, for cooling, for cooking, we're talking about a completely different calculation. And we're not ever talking about that. People are so lost now in listening to these assumptions that ultimately come from big business. So it really helps have a bit of clarity about this difference between global and local. Any other comments or questions before we finish? It's getting quite late.
Yeah, kept you a while.
Yeah. Any comments? Tia? No? Bronte?
I'd like to say that to what extent do you feel like it is a plan to go towards a global totalitarian system where this whole energy thing at the moment, the blowing up of the Nord Stream gas and so on, and knowing they must know perfectly well that there isn't enough wind and so, and yet they're stopping coal and things. So it seems to me like there's a greater plan that I think is way above Anthony Albanese and his government, for example, that actually wants the breakdown of civilization in some way so that they can bring in their digital currency and their system, credit score system like in China. Do you think that's possible?
I think that if we really just spent, I just wish we could do it visually. I think that if we looked back and if we saw the systematic destruction of farmers, of the small, pushing people into cities, destroying self-reliance, destroying self-respect, and we need to know that there's a lot of evidence that when we break down community, and we're talking about intergenerational, real interdependent community, we create people who are very vulnerable to fascistic manipulation. And people like Hannah Arendt and so on talking about what happened in Germany. They were aware of that, but they weren't looking at the economic side of it. But they actually recognized that when people are cut off from their community, they become easily manipulated. So I think there's been a build-up to this that now is sort of an automatic pilot. And it's the automatic pilot is literally automatic. Remember the film, please all of you remember the film, The Social Dilemma. The Social Dilemma says very clearly that algorithms know that it's lucrative for us to become more and more polarized and divided. Now, if you have a system that is now shaping discourse, particularly among young people, but the whole world, that thrives on creating divisiveness and polarization. And I'm just hearing, I have a close friend in New York whose grandson has now unjustly been accused of rape at his college, and he has been demonized now by his whole gang. The college doesn't dare to defend him because they're afraid of being, I can't even remember the complications, because he's actually black. That somehow there's something going on so that the college doesn't dare to defend him because they're afraid of being accused of racism. And anyway, it's just like systems are horrific now. And young people that are insecure form gangs. That's happened in the past. The gang formations are uprooted young men angry and frustrated, not finding work. So we really, I think there is a plan, but it's a plan that it wasn't shaped by humans. It was shaped by people who fed into ideas and didn't realize they were supporting this big system. And now we're seeing a lot of people on the left with the best values supporting this type of Green New Deal that is actually really destructive. And I don't want to get into COVID, but I would say that COVID is another example of the terrible polarization and the way that we're not getting the full picture. So I think really it's really important that we do look at that bigger picture. And always approach it with compassion and with the assumption that we want to deal with people with kindness and open-heartedness and open-mindedness, and not assume if someone chose to be vaccinated they must be evil, or if someone promoted, or dumb either. Just that we really approach people with respect and assume the best. Obviously not to naivete.
They dropped 33,000 fines for COVID today. That's rather good. And perhaps just I mention astrologically, when Pluto goes into Aquarius, beginning 2024, really in 25, it's so much more community-minded that we really do stand a chance from that. That it's the sort of the last call of the Capricornian status quo now, and it's about to die with any luck.
Well, it would be wonderful, and I think we just need to also not rest and wait for the stars to do the work for us, but also to do a lot of everything that we can, to thank you all very much.
Thank you. Well, that was really wonderful.